Today we're going to dive into the question that's on no one's mind. Is the Steam Deck a console? Let's get to it. In a few Steam Deck reviews, the reviewers have either talked about how console-like Steam Decks are, or outright referred to it as one during the review. We committed this cardinal sin here in our Steam Deck OLED review, and immediately paid the price. But as we talked about this to more gamers, we saw that the answer wasn't cut and dry. At the opposite ends of the spectrum, we had two camps. There were people who were adamant that the Steam Deck was a handheld PC, which is absolutely not a console, because PCs do specific things. At the other end, there are people who say that it does everything that a console does, including providing a console-like experience, which makes it a console. And then there were people who existed in the middle, somewhere outside of those two camps, who talked themselves in and out of both positions as they considered what it even meant to be a console. So let's peel back the layers of this discourse and see if we can answer the question, is the Steam Deck a console? Before we can even answer that question, we first have to understand what a console even is. According to Copilot, a video game console is an electronic device that outputs a video signal or image to display a video game that can be played with a game controller. That description casts a pretty wide net. By this wording, smartphones and watches are consoles, because both have screens that can output games that can be played with either virtual or physical controllers. As we asked around about this question, we discovered that, to many people, a console is a device that's less just about being something that lets you play video games, and more about meeting a series of expectations. Yes, a console plays video games, but how it lets you play video games while meeting those expectations is where the nuance kicks in. Back in the Stone Ages, to play a video game, humans had to depend on these massive machines that were mostly only found at universities. These machines were definitely not consoles. They were multiple machines and electronics strung together to make a single video game possible. But they were electronic devices that output video signals to display a video game that could be played with a controller. It would take almost 10 years for scientists and engineers to figure out how to unshackle these games from their supercomputer confines and get them onto hardware that was a bit more realistic. This eventually resulted in consumer-level hardware that's now widely considered the first generation of consoles. These were devices that output games to screens and had input devices that let you play these games. And this is largely how things were for the first 25 to 30 years of game consoles. Moore's Law allowed the game hardware to get faster and more powerful, but the experience was largely the same. A device, a screen, and a specialized input device. But miniaturization and electronics go hand in hand, and eventually dedicated gaming devices emerged, and these devices led to what we call the first generation of handheld consoles. The handheld game console is a portable device that has everything you need to play multiple video games right on the device, a screen and an input device. But aside from the portability, the base experience was largely the same. Off the shelf, these devices only ran software that was made for them, and almost all that software was some type of game. But while this was happening in the console space, computers also continued to benefit from miniaturization, and eventually, personal computers were something that middle-class families could afford. But PCs weren't marketed as gaming devices. Instead, marketing called out that gaming was just one of the things that they were capable of. And at the time, gaming didn't receive any special treatment at the OS level. You had to load them up just like you loaded up any other piece of software. And they often took more effort on the part of the end user to actually get up and running. But by the 90s, PC gaming started to flex its versatility muscle, and gaming became a force there as well. At that time, the world was mostly divided into two types of games: console games and PC games. This was largely due to games being designed for the underlying capabilities and dominant input type of each platform. PCs were primarily keyboard and mouse based, where consoles were some form of XY axis for moving things around on screen and A/B start select buttons for making choices. PCs had gamepads, but they were each kind of their own thing. And back in the day, there wasn't really one brand or type that was connected to every system. If there was anything dominant, we're guessing it was something like a Thrustmaster flight stick. So this concept of PC and console game types grew. PCs were where you went for CRPGs, real-time strategy games, flight sims, and first-person shooters. And consoles were where you went for platformers, and fighting games, and JRPGs, and the like. But around Y2K, lines started to blur between the two devices. While there are many reasons why this happened, one of the biggest was when Microsoft rolled out DirectX. In a nutshell, this set of APIs allowed developers to write to DirectX for things like game controls and audio, and DirectX would translate it over to the operating system. To put it another way, DirectX was one of the first big steps towards unifying how games are made on PC. And while console to PC ports date back to the 70s, back then they were pretty much a ground-up rewrite of the game code over to another set of hardware. Among other things, DirectX was a major step towards making game porting easier. And then Microsoft released the Xbox. On the surface, it was just like any other console, but under the hood, it was ready to leverage high-speed internet access. And this is where the lines between PC and console really started to blur. This was the console's gateway to the wonderful world of post-launch game updating. But love it or hate it, it played a major role in how developers thought about games. Console games were no longer untouchable final products once they hit store shelves. They now behave like PC games in that respect, and issues found after launch could be addressed. We know that the industry impact of this topic alone is worthy of a whole video, but in this video, we're leaving it here for now. Another side effect of Microsoft entering the console space was a renewed move to unify game development practices, and to work towards making one game run on multiple devices instead of having to rewrite it for each device. But as this was happening, consoles were starting to cast a wider net, blurring the lines in the other direction. Along with gaming, they started to advertise functionality like listening to music and watching DVDs, activities that were already in the PC's domain. And then miniaturization showed up again to blur even more lines, and gave us smartphones. Devices as powerful as laptops that could also play games. Handheld game devices that weren't quite game devices. This led to consoles taking cues from smartphones, giving us devices like the Nintendo Switch, blurring the lines between handhelds and consoles. And as more games started to port back and forth from console to PC, audiences of each device grew more diverse in their genre preferences. And eventually, PC games were no longer just simulators and strategy games, and console games are no longer just platformers and fighting games. Modern day gaming has evolved to a point where each device is no longer the domain of a specific game type. Rather, it's about where you go to experience specific IP. Gaming evolution has also continued to merge device functionality. Consoles are now viable for genres like FPS and activities like watching Netflix, and PCs now have dedicated gaming launchers and games designed for gamepad use. But as far as most people are concerned, this still doesn't make consoles mini PCs, nor does it make PCs consoles. So if not, then what does? PCs are ridiculously powerful devices. You can use one to write a novel, record an album, make complex scientific calculations, print action figures, file your taxes, and you can also play games on them. This hasn't changed much since graphical user interfaces were introduced. You still have to install a program and then find that program to do the thing that you want to do. And most of the time, access to these programs lives side by side with one another on your PC. The software you use to write your novel is launched from the same list that Skyrim is. The PC isn't guiding you to do any one thing. And all of this happens across an array of hardware configurations. While the underlying BIOS, CPU, RAM, I/O concepts exist on all PCs, Lenovo might have CPUs in their laptops that are different from the CPUs that Razer uses in theirs. To make matters worse, one PC might only have 8 gigs of RAM, where another has 64, and the same goes for storage. However, consoles offer a different target for developers. If you make a game for a PlayStation 5, you're developing for a stationary target. But for the most part, this is the same with all consoles. Xbox Series S, Xbox Series X, Nintendo Switch. PC hardware targets are more loose, but it's not just hardware variables. PC can also have different versions of the same operating system per device, and each OS variant might have access to different feature sets. And when gaming on PC, you're given a set of recommended requirements, and it's left to the consumer to figure out if a game will run on their system. On console, however, when you buy a game for the Nintendo Switch, it just works. This is an unwritten expectation of video game consoles. If I buy a game for an Xbox Series X and install it on my Series X, it's just going to work. But this isn't the case with PC gaming. You can buy a game that says it's made for Windows 11 PCs, but that's not a guarantee that it'll run on your Windows 11 PC. On console, if you run into an issue with a game, you can reach out to the maker of the console, and they'll help get you sorted. On PC, do you reach out to the developer of the operating system, or the developer of the game, or maybe the manufacturer of the PC, assuming you didn't build it yourself? Again, on console, there's an expectation that troubleshooting issues on the platform is a more unified experience. But what about where you game? If I plug my PS5 into my 4K HDR TV, it detects this and sets things up for me, and I'm gaming in 4K HDR just like that. On PC though, you may or may not have to manually set all of this up yourself. and you may have to turn some fairly obscure settings on or off to get extended features to work with any given game. Again, on console, there's this expectation that access to high-end bells and whistles across hardware just works. The same expectations exist in the input space. If you buy a controller for your Xbox Series device, you expect it to just work when you plug it in. And once again, this isn't always the case with PCs. Yes, we expect these things to just work on PC, but if you hop between PC and console for gaming, you'll know that these expectations are met far more often on console than they are on PC. Then there's the expectation of maintenance. When there's a system update on consoles, we expect to simply click the download button, and after a few minutes and a reboot, our consoles are good to go. On PC, there's operating system updates, motherboard updates, graphic card updates, and most of the time you're only prodded to update the operating system. Everything else is up to the user to track down, and this can be especially cumbersome when troubleshooting game issues. All this is to say that while consoles are these game-centric pieces of hardware, they also meet a set of expectations. On console, we expect games to just work. We expect add-on hardware to just work. We expect updates to just work. And if something goes wrong, we expect to call the number on the back of the box to reach out to Microsoft or Sony or Nintendo to help get us sorted. But once again, miniaturization stepped in to blur even more lines. Before we get to the rest of the video, I want to mention our Patreon. As a subscriber, you'll be listed as a producer of our content. You'll also get access to our custom game cover art that we've put together over the years. You'll likely see it in action in some of our videos. This art works great with custom launchers and really goes a long ways in making a digital game collection look awesome. So click on the link below, head on over to our Patreon, and become a producer today. Okay, back to the video. The concept of hybrid gaming devices have been around almost as long as consoles themselves have. The Speak and Spell was one of the first portable hybrid computers for consumers. They were essentially the first true edutainment devices. They had cartridges like games, but the games were education focused. And throughout the history of video games, there have been several devices that were marketed as hybrid devices and sold to varying degrees of success, but none of them fully lived up to their marketing hype. And some were spectacular failures. And while smartphones are kind of hybrid gaming devices, they're actually their own category of portable computer more than anything else. But in 2017, a true hybrid gaming device finally broke through to the masses. The Nintendo Switch was the first to successfully combine the convenience of handheld and the depth of console gaming into one seamless experience. Others had tried this, but the Switch was the first to really pull it off at scale. The secret sauce wasn't really the Switch itself, rather it was the docking experience. Nintendo had fine-tuned the device so that you could be playing a game on the go, walk up to a TV, place the Switch in a dock, and seamlessly transfer over to a console-like couch experience. And again, while this concept wasn't new, the Switch was the first to pull it off so easily. You didn't need to call up your local geek to ask how to do it. It just worked. The Switch was a true hybrid. Both the handheld and console experiences were fully fleshed out, and Nintendo pulled this off so well that the future of their Game Boy line is now questionable. Why would they even need a new Game Boy when you can game on the go on the Switch? While Nintendo was busy merging the future of their product lines into one lane, PC hardware makers were also throwing things at the wall to see if anything would stick. The history of handheld PCs pretty much always looked like some form of mini laptop. From the Atari portfolio to WinCE devices, they largely followed the same clamshell concept of a laptop by having a screen and a keyboard, and if you wanted to game on them, you had to connect gaming hardware to the device. But in 2016, Gamepad Digital released the GPD Win, and while it wasn't the first of its kind, it was the first to break through the clutter and turn heads. The GPD Win integrated gamepad controls into the keyboard, so now you didn't have to connect a controller to your PC. This device was game ready, and while it ticked all the boxes of things you needed for gaming on PC, it was still a PC experience that was dominated by the Windows user interface. Windows is great at a lot of things, but regardless of what Microsoft tells you, PC gaming still feels like an afterthought in the overall Windows picture. Windows is mouse and keyboard first, touch a distant second, and gamepad an even more distant third. Though, to be honest, it might be fourth right behind voice. And it's not just the UI, it's the overall UX. Think of Windows as a mall, and the various storefronts are the stores within that mall. The mall looks one way out in the halls, and each individual store has its own style as you walk in. GOG, Steam, Epic, itch.io, Origin, Ubisoft, these are all digital storefronts doing their own thing. And since Microsoft doesn't think about PC gaming as an on-the-go activity, these storefronts are all designed for mouse and keyboard navigation to fall in line with the mall that they exist in. But way back in 2012, while the rest of the world was preoccupied with a Mesoamerican long count calendar, Valve was busy with their plans to quietly change the PC gaming world as we know it. That year, Valve did what Microsoft won't. They released a controller-driven user interface for PC. And it was actually an impressive debut. It added a UI over the Steam PC client that converted it to a 10-foot experience. Software that could be 100% controlled with a gamepad while sitting on a couch from 10 feet away. Just like a console. Along with this, Valve released one of their most underappreciated PC features to date, their controller software. Without going too far into the weeds here, we'll just say that it's one of, if not the most powerful pieces of controller customization software available. Much like what Blizzard games used to be known for, Valve's controller software is easy to learn and difficult to master. And over the next few years, Valve would release a divisive controller that took full advantage of this software. And while we debated the usefulness of their weird controller and the value of their Windows-like attempts to make a Linux-based OS for desktop PCs, little did we know that these forays into PC gaming were really just Valve testing the waters for what was to come next. On July 15th, 2021, Valve announced the Steam Deck. And this is when we got to see Valve's offering merge into one grand but portable vision. Valve was careful in their wording prior to launch, and called the Steam Deck a handheld gaming computer. But some in the media chose to go a different route with the headlines that tried to whip up another console war by referring to it as a Switch competitor or a Switch killer, a notion that Valve themselves publicly shut down several times. While those outlets were busy trying to stoke fanboy outrage, they were missing an opportunity to tell the real story. The Steam Deck would end up being to PC gaming what Switch was to console gaming. Instead of going with a clamshell approach, Valve went with the virtual keyboard concept from smartphones. This allowed them to make the device look and feel much more like a proper handheld console. They also included trackpads that could be used for mouse pointer control, and revised their controller software even more, to the point that determined users could find a way to make even the most keyboard-centric games kinda playable. The Steam Deck felt like a love letter to Steam users. It strapped a screen onto their wonky controller and successfully let us untether our PC game libraries from the desktops that they've been bound to for so many years. There was also a full Linux desktop experience underneath the fancy interface, one that Valve lets you easily switch to, and it's a full-blown desktop operating system. Hook a mouse, keyboard, and monitor up to your Steam Deck, and you'd probably never know that it wasn't a desktop PC. So that settles it then, right? The Steam Deck is simply a PC with a fancy interface that you can switch to if you want a game. On paper, this seems to be the case, but in practice, what we found after talking to a lot of Steam Deck owners, the answer wasn't so clear. What we found was that, aside from a few people who like to tinker, most of the people we talked to never left the main gaming UI. On top of that, most of them only installed games that were deck verified. When we dug further, we found that this group just wanted to play games from their Steam library that just worked on the Steam Deck. The positive feedback also revolved around system updates. Our favorite comment from this group was, "I wish PCs were this easy to update for real." So what we were hearing is that large numbers of deck owners that we talked to never left the gaming interface, and for the most part, only played games that were either deck verified or were told that they worked as if they were deck verified. Maintenance and support were also non-issues, because they were easy to access and implement. To put this another way, a large number of people that we talked to about their Steam Deck usage went into it looking for a console experience and found it front and center. If you stay in the big picture UI and stick to games that are verified, the Steam Deck essentially meets the expectations that consoles offer, and things just work. Ultimately, the Steam Deck's coolest feature is that it can be a console if you want it to be. Sure, it's a full-blown PC underneath, but you can 100% ignore that. This happens with all manner of devices. I can't recall the last time I put a sandwich in a sandwich baggie, but I can tell you the last time I used a baggie to store rubber bands. It was last night. I also can't tell you the last time I used WD-40 to get rid of rust, which is what it's made for. But I've never bought it with that intent. I always bought it because there was a creaky hinge somewhere that needed a shot. The point here is that we can be pedantic about definitions all we want, but if a product continually meets a set of expectations for an activity for a lot of people, then that product might be a hybrid of two products. But how you refer to it is largely going to depend on which hybrid experience you use it for. And both descriptions are going to be right. This is especially true when products look the part too, and this is where we get to the Steam Deck's true nature. Much like the Nintendo Switch, that's a hybrid of handheld and console gaming, the Steam Deck is a hybrid of console and PC gaming. It successfully marries the expectations of console gaming with the flexibility of a personal computer. Its main design leans into its console roots to the point that it looks far more like a console than it does a PC at first glance. And if all you ever want from it is a console experience, you can have just that. But you can lift the hood and access the power of a full desktop OS if you want, because it's also a PC. You may think that the Steam Deck is overrated and overhyped, and in some cases, you're probably right. But it does represent the future of PC gaming's potential. By doing what Microsoft won't, actually listening to the PC gaming community and delivering software and products designed for them instead of generic, mobile-centric, buggy experiences that feel entirely disconnected from what PC gamers actually want. But I digress. Valve is actually doing meaningful things in the PC gaming space here that feel like they're made to please PC gamers instead of shareholders. And as PC gamers, we should encourage and reward more of the former and less of the latter. So what are your thoughts? Is the Steam Deck a handheld PC? Does that mean it can't be a console? Is it both, depending on how you use it? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And as always, remember that we're all on this organic spaceship hurtling through space together. So if you can, take a moment to remember that we've only got each other to rely on while we're on this ride. So be kind. And that about wraps things up. Please like this video if you found it useful, and subscribe to our channel if you want more content like this. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this, and we'll chat again soon.